The moral myth-making and narratives of our time are collapsing, particularly when it comes to Zionism. And I just watched the film The Voice of Hind Rajab, and I think it's a remarkable film for many reasons that I'm going to explain, and it prompted me to write this essay. Much has been made about the doctrinal underpinnings of Zionism, colonialism, imperialism, maybe capitalism, especially recently with the Epstein files, maybe pulling back the cover on certain conversations about Judaism or Jewish supremacy that are a bit uncomfortable. So when I say doctrinal underpinnings, I'm of course asking questions about the relevant holy books, the metaphysical teachings of creation myths, conversations with the divine, the imagined relationships between certain tribes and certain prophecies of salvation or damnation, maybe end-time narratives of messiahs and antichrists. I'm talking about those ideas that are at play, of course, which do help explain current behavior. And while I'm going to steer this essay in a certain different direction, let me just say loudly and plainly up front that those ancient and sometimes not so ancient holy books are absolutely important to dissect and discuss cleanly. There are huge swaths of powerful and dangerous people who engage directly with those texts and consider them divine marching orders and holy revelations, or maybe the direct moral thoughts and commandments of an all-knowing God. These people range from Mike Huckabee, who I'm going to speak about later in this as well, Daniela Weiss and the settler movement, and John Hagee and his Christian Zionism, and obviously plenty of figures from all religious backgrounds. The holy books do matter, and of course people do take them literally, sometimes just as literal history books that tell us exactly how the world is, or maybe about the location of a specific boat that really existed, according to them, with a giant flood that really existed as well. So lately I'm seeing people toss around words like the Torah and especially the Talmud, and maybe passages from the Bible as explanations for things they're seeing in the world. And I do think the general teachings of those things really do matter. I tend to think of religious teachings as more as sort of emphasis, and the differences really matter. Maybe an emphasis in one of being God's chosen people, or an emphasis in another of the ummah and the community and submission, or an emphasis of personal forgiveness and salvation, or maybe an emphasis of seeking less attachment, or maybe something like a divine hierarchy of caste, etc. All of that stuff is important and does affect us all, but I'm going to pivot away from that stuff now, because I contend that in our very modern context, in a world dominated by other forms of moral myth dissemination and mimetic delivery of ideas, there are just other forms of doctrine and holy books which are more important to deal with and discuss. And in particular, I'm talking about filmmaking. So I'm just speaking from my experience here, but I do think it's rather common and representative. So I grew up in a post-Holocaust American Jewish context, which I would just call tacitly Zionist. The moral and material and political support for the project of Israel was just a default in my family and community. But never once did I hear anyone read a single line from something like the Talmud, and stories from the Torah were basically songs that we sung in a language that none of us understood in the context of maybe sporadic synagogue visits. The holy books and doctrines that we're engaged with were not really those things. In fact, I would guess the vast majority of my community and family members didn't take them very seriously at all, nor did they even really believe in the God who was spoken about in them, who was really a pretty insane character to begin with. No, the holy doctrines that I'm talking about that were much more powerful and at play came from this place.
I've never seen 10,000 tapes in one store.
There's so much kid stuff.
And I can keep them for 3 evenings.
The television and the silver screen of movie theaters, they were king in post-World War II American culture, which of course was exported as the most powerful soft power to the rest of the world. This entire medium was just grand. The music, makeup, writing, fantastical images, and heart-pounding action. This was a spectacle that really just blows the holy texts and the holy books out of the water. So, was an American family in the 1990s going to sit around and read the Talmud all night, or was it going to watch Samuel L. Jackson scream, "Waste the motherfuckers," in a hailstorm of bullets and blood? I mean, no contest, right? And what's really important to note here about the images and stories and films I'm talking about of that century is that they were really difficult to produce, and I mean expensive. I mean, the barrier of entry to pulling off a production like that was quite high. Cameras were expensive, the crews were expensive, the film stock itself was expensive, the props were expensive, the special effects were insanely expensive, the best composers were expensive. I mean, everything about a film like True Lies was expensive. And so the ability to make these things was sort of easily and naturally concentrated in the hands of a few Hollywood studios which pumped these kinds of films out regularly. So I'm going to borrow heavily here from the work of the late Jack Shaheen, who wrote a book called Real Bad Arabs: How Hollywood Vilified a People. It was first published in 2001 with an updated edition in 2009. It was also adapted into a 50-minute documentary, which I'm going to show plenty of clips from here. So Shaheen analyzed 1,000 films that featured Arab and Muslim characters that were produced between 1896 and 2000, and he found a great majority, by his count 936 titles, were negative in their portrayal. And I mean, really negative. And to give you just a sampling of what we're talking about here, he includes things like this. This is the opening song of Disney's much beloved Aladdin animated film. Pay attention to the lyrics here.
Oh, I come from a land, from a faraway place, where the caravan camels roam, where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home.
It's barbaric, but it's home. And then this one, a seemingly replaceable plot point in something like a film Back to the Future, a film I love, by the way, where, okay, the writers need to come up with a reason and a device that Doc gets killed in front of Marty and he has to witness it. So, let's see, what can we come up with? Oh, I have it. A group of Libyan terrorists will gun him down in a suburban parking lot at night, right? That works. Of course, to endless military adventures and FBI and CIA type films of like Executive Decision, Patriot Games, Hell Squad, The Delta Force, Navy SEALs, The Siege, Sleeper Cell, the television series 24. I could go on and on. Many of those were partially funded by the military as well. But perhaps the most egregious example that he points out is the film Rules of Engagement, which is about a special military unit that gets into some trouble after mowing down and slaughtering a crowd of protesters in Yemen. And at first, you think these U.S. soldiers are guilty, bloodthirsty monsters for doing this. But the twist of this one is that over the course of the film and this kind of tribunal, you start to see more perspectives of what actually happened, and you gather more information, and you come to understand, that actually the crowd in Yemen, they fired first, and they were actually armed to the teeth. And in one of probably the most sickest things in the entire decade was that this little girl is seen. She's adorable, right? Sympathetic. She has only one leg. And our protagonist sees her and sees the humanity in her. But guess what? Actually, we find out, she was part of it. She was hiding a gun and shooting at Americans and out for blood. And it was only then, at that point, that Samuel L. Jackson's character shouted the fateful order of "Waste the motherfuckers."
Waste the motherfuckers!
Because in the end, the massacre of even women and children has been justified and applauded. It's a slaughter, yes, but it's a righteous slaughter.
Sergeant Mack.
Sir?
Contact all stations. Mission complete.
Shaheen also points out that many of the films were being pumped out by a select few studios. For example, Cannon Pictures, which was acquired in 1979 by two Israeli cousins, Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. I'm just going to let Shaheen tell us a bit about this company and their output here.
One reason we've not been allowed to empathize with any Palestinian on the silver screen is due to two Israeli producers, Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus. These two filmmakers created an American company called Cannon, and they released in a period of 20 years at least 30 films which vilify all things Arab, particularly Palestinians. They even came out with a film called Hell Squad, showing Vegas showgirls trouncing Arabs in the middle of the desert. I think the most effective film they've ever done, one of the most popular and most racist, is the Delta Force. Here Palestinians hijack a plane and terrorize the passengers, especially the Jewish ones.
Pick out the passport with Jewish names.
There is no form of communication more powerful than film in creating propaganda, and Golan and Globus took it to another level.
Stop it! Stop it!
Certainly American producers play a role in vilifying Palestinians. I mean, perhaps the most anti-Palestinian film is True Lies.
This apparently is the same group which just detonated a nuclear bomb in the Florida Keys.
Crimson Jihad will rain fire on one major U.S. city each week until our demands are met.
This film is shown on television almost every week, over and over.
Wait, just rewind the True Lies thing. Did you hear that little detail?
This apparently is the same group which just detonated a nuclear bomb in the Florida Keys.
I mean, the Florida Keys, definitely target number one for international terrorists, right? No detail left unturned. I'm surprised they just didn't say Boca Raton at that point. Sorry, serious topic. And Shaheen also points out the incredibly influential Zionist film, of course, Exodus in 1960, and then another film that he talks about here, I'm going to let him speak, which features a certain image at the end.
It dealt with the very early conflict. Here, Palestinians are either invisible or they're linked with Nazis, perpetrators of horrific acts. The 1966 movie Cast a Giant Shadow is another early film presenting Israelis as innocent victims of Palestinian violence. Kirk Douglas is an American military specialist, and he goes to assist the Israelis. Some of the dialogue in this film reads like it came straight from the public relations department of the Israeli government.
Now, here's a country surrounded by 5 Arab nations ready to shove them into the Mediterranean. No guns, no tanks, no friends, nothing. People fighting with their bare hands for a little piece of desert.
The Palestinians in this movie are the lowest of the low. We see them solely as vicious gunmen, wide-eyed maniacs. They will kill anyone, anywhere, anytime, for any reason. There's one brutal image in particular of a burnt-out bus with a dead Jewish woman tied to its side, with the Star of David carved into her back.
So my point here is that this body of work, this stuff, this is what actually seeps into the body politic and the American psyche and imagination. This stuff, these images, these stories, even if it wasn't directly digested, it became part of the natural rhythm and assumptions of the modern myth dissemination. And because of the high cost of production and distribution, it was difficult to break into that mainstream conversation with counter-narratives. Sure, there were films that broke the mold from time to time. I'm not suggesting a complete level of control, but positioning certain ideological pushes with the right gatekeepers like Zionism was a very strong force to steer the car of the conversation from maybe the back seat. And I'm also pointing out Jack Shaheen because of his biography. He was born outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1935 to Lebanese immigrants. And my mother was born in Pittsburgh 16 years later to a Jewish family. And I imagine this diet that I'm talking about of media was experienced rather differently for both of them, just as sort of neighbors there. And so I'm only speaking for myself here, but that side of the family that kind of tacitly identifies as Zionists, I would bet that not a single one of them has read the Talmud in detail or studied the Torah seriously. But this modern mythology of good and evil and a kind of twisted, forced hand of utilitarianism that Samuel L. Jackson represents there, this moral necessity argumentation, that was constantly promoted to them and I think deeply digested. So if one is looking to deprogram a Zionist of their ilk, you would be wasting your time, I think, trying to examine the Talmud and reinterpret biblical passages. This is the holy doctrine that I think is buried in the imagination, in their minds. I think, by the way, as a reference, South Park produced just a masterpiece with their trilogy called Imagination Land that points out the absurdity of this entire process, so bookmark that if you haven't seen it. It's just gold. But things in the last couple decades have really started to change. Since the advent of digital filmmaking and the increasingly lower and lower barriers of entry to produce high quality image and sound, and the explosion, of course, of diverse screens and outlets to consume the myths and storytelling of our time. By the way, there's, of course, plenty of negative things to say about having screens everywhere. But the ability, I think, because of these things, to kind of bully out challenging narratives simply because you have a bigger budget and a soundstage in Hollywood has really decreased. And clearly, of course, the world's events have prompted many people to reassess this mythology in any case. And the younger generation was, of course, more difficult to ensnare because of these factors. So for some, the events of October 7th, 2023 were simply a reflection of what all the media of the previous decades had prepared them to expect from the Arab world. And then even, of course, when 9/11 happened and everybody almost uniformly said it felt like they were watching a Hollywood movie, I think that was kind of no surprise or accident. And then I think what also goes unnoticed about 9/11 is it happened about 2 years after the Second Intifada really got going, which was much more violent in Palestine after the collapse of Oslo. And I think the Zionists also had some fear of losing the narrative even there, and it was important that that violence for them be swallowed up in kind of a global war on terror and fit into this moral mythology that Hollywood had been producing for so long. And 9/11, think what you want of it, pulled that off for them. I know people are revisiting that conversation of 9/11 very deeply. I've always been there for that conversation, and so I'm here for that conversation again and will not shy away from it. But that's just a note on 9/11. And the motivations for such violence had already been set by the doctrine of something like true lies. And the response, which would be coming surely from Israel and the West or whatever, the military response, had already been set and bracketed by the ethics of the rules of engagement. By the way, that story for that film, The Rules of Engagement, it came from a guy named James Webb, who was a Democratic senator from Virginia and served as Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Navy. And to go back to Mike Huckabee, just for an example of how I think this is really at play, is of course Mike Huckabee is someone who takes his holy books of the Bible really seriously and literally. And of course there's clips going around with him in his conversation with Tucker Carlson, including where he references the Bible and that Israel can take the whole thing because of the Euphrates to the Nile. But then there's also clips like this one. Listen to this exchange.
I said, how many children have been killed?
War is a horrible thing, period. And we don't know. We know that a lot of the numbers were reported by Hamas.
But you said you think thousands of children have been killed.
Yeah, and a lot of times, you know why they got killed? Because Hamas would gather up the children and put them in the targets. Do you know what Israel does? They send page messages and they send texts to every cell phone in Gaza, and they say, we're going to hit this particular target. They drop leaflets and they announce where they're going to hit. Nobody does that. The U.S. doesn't do that. Israel does that in order to prevent, let me finish this. They do this in order to prevent civilian casualties. What Hamas does, they say, oh, this is the target. And by gunpoint, they push people into those various places. And then when people get killed, they say, look, Israel just slaughtered these people, even though it was Hamas who moved them into harm's way, knowing that it was going to put them in a place of danger and death and destruction. War is a horrible thing, Tucker, and there are people who end up, unfortunately, being killed that shouldn't have been. I would tell you that I wish that none of those people in Gaza had been killed after October 8th. Well, I say not none of them. I'm glad Mohammed Sinwar was killed. I'm glad that some of those warriors, the people who masterminded and carried out the atrocities of October 7th.
14-year-old Hamas operatives, how do you feel about their deaths?
If they participated in that, then God help them. I'm telling you,
what
Tucker,
does that mean, God help
I don't know that they were 14 years. No, but I'm telling you that when someone commits the acts of atrocity and then they hold hostages, if these were your children being held hostage in Gaza, what would you do to get them out?
I wouldn't want to kill 14-year-olds, I'll tell you that.
Let me ask you something. Would you do whatever it took to get your kids back if they were being tortured, raped, starved, and beaten?
I would not kill children, period.
Well, I'm just telling you.
And I would never make excuses for killing children either.
And I'm not talking about targeting children. I'm talking about...
You told me that 14-year-olds deserve to die because they're working for Hamas.
I'm telling you...
My question is, can you hear yourself?
I do hear myself.
So do you think a 14-year-old child has agency? Do you think that he deserves to die because he's being used by adults? Isn't his death a crushing tragedy?
If he's holding a gun and he's pointing it at someone who's trying to save a hostage, and the only way to save that hostage, I'm telling you, war is a horrible thing. It's a horrible thing. And a lot of...
I mean, of course, Tucker doesn't ask for any evidence to back up that claim. But that fantasy, where is it coming from other than sort of the mythology of the action films of the 90s, that somehow that's in his head? And it might even hit some viewers as somewhat reasonable. I mean, this is why on October 7th, they could come out with a story of something like beheading 40 babies. And you might just shrug and be like, well, I guess that's kind of what they do in that part of the world. I mean, where else? That's not coming from the holy books there. That's coming from the holy books of the Hollywood doctrine, right? But things are starting to change, really. And maybe this change in the film industry started last year with Jonathan Glazer's Zone of Interest, which is just an insanely good film. And in his acceptance speech, he said this.
All our choices were made to reflect and confront us in the present, not to say, look what they did then, rather look what we do now. Our film shows where dehumanization leads at its worst. It shaped all of our past and present. Right now, we stand here as men who refute their Jewishness and the Holocaust being hijacked by an occupation which has led to conflict for so many innocent people. Whether the victims of October...
And that struck right at the heart of the post-1948 Zionist project by, him saying applying the lessons of genocide and the Holocaust universally rather than tribally. But I think it's picking up even more steam now. This year's film circuit is getting underway, and there are films like Palestine 36, All That's Left of You, and of course The Voice of Hind Rajab, and I think they're impossible to ignore. And The Voice of Hind Rajab in particular, I feel, is a turning point. I'm thinking of that one-legged girl from James Webb's Sick Imagination in The Rules of Engagement and Hind Rajab, because you can say that dramatization and, the slick techniques of filmmakers are always a form of propaganda. And believe me, I know the power of these techniques. I'm a filmmaker. It's my field. Even in this little YouTube example, consider how much worse this moment of the film is. And you might not think it's that big of a deal, but I assure you that you take me much more seriously when I look and sound like this, and maybe even do a little push and transition like this. So, in my teenage years, as cell phone videos just started to become a little more commonplace, certain images might surface that were trying to compete or maybe disprove the official lines and narratives of something like the IDF or the American government. They would have their story and narrative of how things went, which, might have led to a dead body or a lot of dead bodies and children and civilians who ended up dead. And their narratives, they all sounded a lot like something that James Webb and Hollywood would have dreamt up. But that doctrinal mythology worked its way into us, and many people just kind of accepted it that it must be true because there really wasn't counter evidence for it. And if a cell phone video seemed to tell another story, that maybe the truth was a little different, in my family, it would be kind of derided or considered fake or not real. They called it Pallywood for Palestine Hollywood, and they would just call it fake and just wouldn't accept it. But now, I think Hollywood, or I should say Hollywood effectiveness, the techniques of Hollywood, because of course they're going to different non-traditional sources for funding, but the Hollywood techniques have arrived to tell these stories and package these stories. And so now I want to break down, I think, a amazing piece of filmmaking that tells this story in The Voice of Hind Rajab. I think it's so good. I think it's a moment that's going to be talked about in film schools for a very long time about the medium of documentary filmmaking and the techniques of Hollywood, because they combine raw documentary footage with the actual phone call that Hind Rajab made, of course, with the Red Crescent that probably most of us have heard, as well as some genuine cell phone footage of the dispatchers at work. I mean, this shot it literally drifts from in and out of that realm, that world where you see the cell phone, the raw actual footage, and it kind of, reveals the magic trick as it's happening, where you move past it and through it, where you get the Hollywood techniques of lighting and makeup and actors and sound and the lens flares and the expensive cameras. And all of that stuff is the stuff that turns this into something like this. I mean, this just incredible moment, it comes later in the film, is just this brilliant way of sort of breaking the fourth wall, which just unapologetically announces that it's applying the artistry of film to something which otherwise is a social media moment, no matter how powerful it is. And that process, of course, is not new. I think it's just a modern form of something that religions figured out a long time ago, where they applied grandeur to the stories that would turn something like this into this. I'm seeing a fairly dramatic and massively important shift that's happening. And it's right on schedule, frankly, after the kind of shock of 2023 and how long it takes the filmmaking machine to get itself moving and get funding and produce these types of films. And yes, I'm aware of the challenges and roadblocks that films like these are facing with distribution and trying to find the audiences that they're trying to reach. I think that's despicable. I'm aware of those distribution problems that they're facing. But I think the Zionists know that they've really lost the kind of grip and stranglehold on the modes of media and moral myth production and narrative control here. I don't think there's any turning back from this. And to not just pick on the Zionists here, this same mythical and imagination shift and control has happened with something like the murder of Alex Preddy by ICE or Renee Good, where the narrative power of the government or mainstream has really lost all credibility. And I certainly think that this moment of the loss of moral framing and the ability to control that framing by certain ideologies like Zionism is a tremendously dangerous moment in the cycle. If it's true that they have always been brutal and cruel, but they could promote a kind of narrative of morality and maybe sympathy for their actions to the world, perhaps encapsulated by no one else than Golda Meir when she said, "We can forgive them for killing our babies, but we cannot forgive them for making us kill theirs." Then what happens when they lose that veneer of morality and ability to frame the moral necessity, even through the techniques of Hollywood, even with a film about Golda that came out recently? Well, when that moral righteousness and assumption of morality strips away, well, then all that's left what was there in the first place, which was just cruelty. I mean, take, for example, something like Yitzhak Rabin's policy of breaking their bones, which he implemented in 1988 in order to suppress the peaceful uprising of Palestinians around that time, known as the First Intifada.
the Israeli government adopted a strategy, in the words of Defense Minister Itzhak Rabin, of might, power, and beatings, which became known as the break the bone strategy.
In 1988, of course, there was some VHS cameras and handycams around, and they could capture images like this, and that could cause a bit of a public relations headache for someone like Rabin. But there was no festival-winning film which featured the boy in this video. In fact, I don't know his name, the way that we probably all know Hind Rajab's name, as well as we know the name Anne Frank at this point, fittingly. By the way, Yitzhak Rabin, who implemented the Breaking the Bones policy, Nobel Peace Prize winner as well. The system tends to create awards and give them to themselves to reinforce these narratives as well, so take that for what that's worth. But at the same moment as that footage from 1988 of breaking their bones may have been making a segment or two in the nightly news in 1988, a film like The Taking of Flight 847 was broadcast on NBC. It was a film that dramatized the story of the Hezbollah-affiliated hijacker named Muhammad Ali Hamadi.
Well, I mean, I understand a little bit, not that much. I mean, not enough to really to talk it.
Jude. Yehud. Jew! Jew! Jew!
By the way, the actor who ended up portraying him in the film, Eli Donker, an Israeli Jew. Go figure. So now I think we have to be prepared for a shift in the strategy of narrative filmmaking. And I think it was perfectly reflected in another moment of imagery. I'm thinking of the moment when the flotilla was on its way to Gaza. This was the bigger one, where Greta Thunberg got on the boat and she boarded it with a red suitcase, one that looked like this. And of course, people were calling this a stunt, a pleasure yacht, a selfie cruise. And yes, let's be honest here. I don't think they were trying to feed all of Gaza with boats full of food, no matter how many. Everyone knew what was happening to them. It was a kind of publicity stunt, a kind of statement. They were trying to prove a point. And so, okay, what would Israel do in this test of this knowing confrontation that's going to happen with the flotilla? Well, they know how to control the narrative, right? They know how to broadcast the moral narrative, right? They know how to project morality and restraint and compassion to the world, no matter what we think of them, don't they, right? This guy knows the story.
This selfie flotilla now, it's bigger, and it will be a kind of a different situation for Israeli security forces to deal with. And I think that Israel will go about this as we have done with previous provocations, which is to stop them from entering, stop them from endangering themselves or Israeli troops, bring them into custody, and then quickly and swiftly and humanely send them back to wherever they came from.
Well, what happened? Of course, Greta and her colleagues and all the boats were stopped and abducted one by one. And then there were some reports that started to filter out that they had been abused and beaten up, which would go against some of that Hollywood stuff. Perhaps some people still filled with certain mythologies may have thought that they were exaggerating. I mean, recall the image of the Star of David from the film that Shaheen points out. It's an almost Christ-like image of the perpetual victimhood and pain, this deep historical cut of persecution. So I wonder what those people thought when Israel returned Greta Thunberg's bag and it looked like this. Yeah, that's the word whore written on it in a black Sharpie and an erect hairy penis next to the Star of David. Perhaps some people at that point would recall a news story from a Palestinian who claimed that he had the Star of David carved into his cheek by an IDF soldier after he was arrested. Perhaps they now believed him, even without photographic evidence or a Hollywood film. I mean, this moment, this Greta bag, it wasn't Abu Ghraib, which was a scandal. Those photos from Abu Ghraib were never supposed to come out. They were an embarrassment, and people were fired and prosecuted for them. You know, those photos from Abu Ghraib clashed with the Hollywood images and mythology that we had of the United States military and its moral conduct, no matter what the truth was. It wasn't who we were. It wasn't what was represented. You know, we would apologize for them and hold people accountable. We promised. I mean, at least a little. This situation with Greta's bag, this was different. This is where you have one of the most recognizable and popular humans on planet Earth in front of you. You know she's going to be seen. You know people are going to ask about this. And so what do? You want people to see this. You know, we've lost control of the most moral army, blah, 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 all that bullshit. Okay, well, let's go the other way then. Let's just go with open cruelty. And so I think the strategy, oddly, of the Zionists has really flipped here. Before, with all of these films, it was to try to get you to hate and fear Muslims, and Arabs in particular. And now their Hail Mary pass, now that that's falling apart, is to get you to hate Jews, which they, of course, will try to twist into chants of anti-Semitism in order to just justify and rationalize their increasingly obvious ambitions and intentions and actions in the world. And as hard as it is sometimes, my advice to you is to try to resist their strategy. We should all take a lesson from the way Greta herself responded to this bag, which was like this. She laughed at them and called them children. Because I know these moments are dark, and I think we are at a really tremendously important and dangerous turning point. And I'm sure much of the filmmaking world eventually, I promise you this, is going to pat itself on the back and pretend it was always on the right side of history and always stood on the side of Palestinian justice. Try not to roll your eyes too hard when that happens. That's just what they do, I promise. But I, for one, am excited about the next wave of image makers and storytellers and filmmakers, which are emerging to finally narrate from the Global South with the potent techniques of filmmaking, a medium and art form I love and produce. There are films coming out of Africa, for example, that are just look incredible. Here's one out of Nigeria. I haven't seen it yet, but it looks incredible. And here is that filmmaker's acceptance speech at an award ceremony.
And lastly, to all those whose parents migrated to obtain a better life for their children, to the economic migrant, the conflict migrant, those under occupation, dictatorship, persecution, and those experiencing genocide, you matter, your stories matter more than ever. Your dreams are an act of resistance. To those watching at home, archive your loved ones, archive your stories, yesterday, today, and forever, for Nigeria, for London, the Congo, Sudan, free Palestine. Thank you.
And so clearly, the world is going through massive changes, and the storytellers and filmmakers are here to participate in it, I hope. And I'm sure that this era of filmmaking is going to be just slightly better than a film like True Lies. So if you liked that, please like the video and consider subscribing, and comment below some films that maybe we should all watch that maybe for terrible examples of this kind of stuff, or maybe some good examples. There are good examples of this that even Shaheen writes about this, or recent films that are breaking the mold and fit into this category that we should all keep our eye on. I love watching films. I'm sure other people do as well. And if you really want to help the channel too, I do have a membership program where I host a monthly Zoom call for members every month for about an hour. In fact, much of this essay came from some discussions that I had with members and got some ideas from them. It's really fun. We hang out for once a month and prepare me for some of my new conversations coming up. I ask questions, I learn a lot. It's a lot of fun. So you can jump in and join the little growing dilemma community that we have there, and that would be amazing. And that's it for me, and I'll see you next time. Stay safe, Florida Keys.
Apparently it's the same group which just detonated a nuclear bomb in the Florida Keys.
Crimson Jihad will rain fire on one major U.S. city each week until our demands are